The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Murphy's Bar as Jake Mitchell pulled his old pickup truck into a space near the back. He preferred the quiet spots, away from the main entrance where people might stare or whisper. At 28, Jake carried himself with the careful posture of someone who had learned to measure every movement, every word, every breath. His right leg moved with a slight limp as he stepped out of the truck. 3 years had passed since the IED explosion in Afghanistan that ended his career as a Navy SEAL, but his body still reminded him daily of that moment when everything changed. The doctors called it a miracle that he walked at all. Jake called it stubborn pride. Murphy's Bar sat on the edge of downtown, a working-class establishment that served decent food and cold beer without pretense. Jake had discovered it 6 months ago when he moved to this small Oregon town, looking for somewhere quiet to rebuild whatever was left of his life. The owner, Tom Murphy, was a Vietnam veteran who understood the value of silence and never asked questions about the scars that crisscrossed Jake's arms or the way he sometimes stared at nothing for long minutes. Today felt different, though. Jake could sense it the moment he walked through the heavy wooden door. The usual afternoon crowd of construction workers and retirees had been joined by a group of younger men clustered around the pool table in the corner. Their loud laughter and aggressive posturing immediately set Jake's nerves on edge. "Hey, Jake." Tom nodded from behind the bar, his weathered face creased with concern. "Usual spots open." Jake made his way to his regular table near the back wall, positioning himself where he could see the entire room. Old habits died hard, and situational awareness remained as natural as breathing. He ordered his standard black coffee and turkey sandwich, trying to ignore the growing volume from the pool table area. The group consisted of 5 men in their early 20s, all wearing expensive designer clothing and gold jewelry that caught the light when they moved. Their leader appeared to be a tall, heavily muscled man with sleeve tattoos and a swagger that suggested he was used to getting his way. Jake recognized the type immediately: guys who had never faced real danger but compensated with manufactured toughness and territorial behavior. "Did you see that homeless-looking freak who just walked in?" one of them said loudly enough for half the bar to hear. "Looks like he crawled out of a dumpster." Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on his coffee cup. He had learned to pick his battles carefully since leaving the Navy. Some fights weren't worth the energy, and he had more important things to focus on than the opinions of strangers. "Probably one of those fake veterans begging for handouts," another voice chimed in. "I bet he never even served. Just wants sympathy money." The sandwich turned to cardboard in Jake's mouth. He set it down carefully and took a slow breath, counting to 10 the way his therapist had taught him. Dr. Saracen had spent countless sessions helping him develop coping strategies for moments like this, when the combination of chronic pain, survivor's guilt, and civilian ignorance threatened to overwhelm his carefully constructed calm. Tom Murphy appeared at his table with a fresh pot of coffee. "Don't let them get to you," he said quietly. "They'll drink themselves stupid and leave soon enough." But Jake could see the disappointment in the older man's eyes. Tom had served 2 tours in Vietnam and understood exactly what those comments meant to someone who had given everything for his country. The disrespect wasn't just directed at Jake, it was an insult to every service member who had paid a price for their commitment. The group's laughter grew more raucous as they consumed more alcohol. Their pool game devolved into an excuse for increasingly crude commentary about other patrons in the bar. They mocked an elderly man's shaky hands, made crude remarks about a woman eating lunch alone, and continued their running commentary about Jake's appearance. "Look at him sitting there all quiet and pathetic," the leader said, lining up a shot on the pool table. "Probably can't even afford to drink anything stronger than coffee. What a loser." Jake's hands remained steady around his coffee cup, but his mind was elsewhere. He was remembering the faces of his teammates who hadn't made it home from that last mission in Afghanistan. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, who had 2 kids and a wife who made the best tamales Jake had ever tasted. Petty Officer David Kim, who could speak 4 languages and always had a joke ready when morale got low. Lieutenant Chris Murphy, no relation to the bar owner, who had been just 3 weeks away from completing his tour when the explosion changed everything. Those men had died heroes. They had given their lives protecting a convoy of Afghan children being evacuated from a combat zone. Jake had been the only survivor, pulled from the wreckage by a Marine unit that happened to be passing through the area. The guilt of surviving when better men didn't had eaten at him for years, driving him to the edge of despair more times than he cared to remember. "I think our friend over there is getting upset," one of the men observed with obvious amusement. "Maybe we should go cheer him up." Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest that signaled an approaching anxiety attack. His breathing became shallow, and sweat began to gather on his forehead despite the air conditioning. The noise of the bar seemed to fade, replaced by the phantom sounds of explosions and screaming that haunted his dreams. But then, he remembered something else Dr. Chen had told him during their sessions. The attacks were temporary. The feelings would pass. And he had survived much worse than the ignorant comments of drunk civilians. Tom Murphy was watching from behind the bar, his hand resting near the baseball bat he kept for emergencies. Several of the regular customers had noticed the tension and were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The afternoon that had started quietly was building toward something that nobody wanted to see happen. Jake finished his coffee with deliberate calm and left exact change on the table, including his usual generous tip for the waitress. He stood slowly, his injured leg protesting the movement, and began walking toward the door. The smart play was to leave before the situation escalated further. He had nothing to prove to these people, and getting into a confrontation would only validate their assumptions about veterans being unstable. "That's right, hobble on out of here," the leader called after him. "This place is for real men anyway." Jake paused at the door, his hand on the handle. Every instinct developed through years of military training screamed at him to turn around and address the disrespect. But he also knew that violence would solve nothing and potentially create more problems than it solved. He was almost to his truck when he heard footsteps behind him. Turning around, he saw that 3 members of the group had followed him outside. The leader walked with the exaggerated confidence of someone emboldened by alcohol and peer pressure. "Hey, soldier boy," the man called out. "We weren't finished talking to you." Jake said nothing, instead focusing on reaching his truck door. But the men spread out to block his path, their body language shifting from mockery to genuine aggression. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Another man stepped closer, close enough that Jake could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Or are you just another fake who can't back up the tough guy act?" "I don't want any trouble," Jake said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. "I'm just trying to leave." "That's what I thought," the leader sneered. "All talk and no action. Probably got that limp falling down some stairs, not fighting for his country." The comment hit Jake like a physical blow. He thought about his teammates again, about their families who would never see them come home. About the children they had died protecting, children who would grow up free because American servicemen had been willing to pay the ultimate price. But he also thought about the promise he had made to Dr. Chen and to himself. He would not let his anger control him anymore. He would not become the stereotype these men expected him to be. "You're right," he said simply. "I'm not looking for a fight." The admission seemed to embolden the group further. They moved closer, forming a loose circle around Jake near his truck. The parking lot was mostly empty, with only a few cars scattered around the perimeter. Inside the bar, the remaining patrons were probably unaware of what was happening outside. "See, I told you he was all show," the leader announced to his companions. "Probably bought that military haircut at a barbershop and learned to walk with a limp from watching war movies." Jake reached for his truck door again, but one of the men slammed it shut before he could open it. "We're not done with you yet, fake soldier," the man said with a cruel smile. "I think you owe us an apology for pretending to be something you're not. And maybe a little compensation for wasting our time," the leader added. "Empty your pockets and let's see what you've got." Jake realized that the situation had moved beyond simple harassment. These men were now attempting robbery, emboldened by their assumption that he was helpless and alone. They had made the calculation that he was too weak or scared to fight back, and they intended to take advantage of what they saw as easy prey. The irony was not lost on him. Here he was, a man who had spent 8 years in the most elite fighting force in the world, being threatened by drunk civilians who had probably never faced anything more dangerous than a traffic ticket. But Jake also understood that his training came with responsibilities. The skills he had learned were meant to protect the innocent, not to dominate people who were more stupid than evil. "I'm going to ask you one more time to let me leave," Jake said, his voice carrying a subtle change in tone that would have been recognizable to anyone with military experience. "You don't want to continue down this path." But the men were too intoxicated and overconfident to recognize the warning. Instead, they interpreted his restraint as fear and moved even closer. "Or what?" the leader challenged. "You'll call your mommy? Face it, old man, you're outmatched and outnumbered. Just give us whatever you've got and maybe we'll let you crawl away with your dignity intact." Jake looked around the parking lot one more time, confirming that they were alone and that no innocent bystanders were in danger of being hurt by whatever happened next. He thought about his teammates one final time, about the oath he had taken to defend his country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Then, he thought about something else Dr. Chen had taught him. Sometimes the most courageous thing a person could do was walk away from a fight. But sometimes, courage meant standing up to bullies who preyed on people they perceived as weak or vulnerable. These men had made their choice. They had chosen to follow him outside, to threaten him, to attempt robbery, and to dishonor the memory of better men who had died in service to their country. They had mistaken his restraint for weakness and his desire to avoid conflict for cowardice. Jake Mitchell had spent 3 years learning to control his anger, to channel his training in positive directions, and to find peace despite the trauma he carried. But he had never forgotten how to be a Navy SEAL. "All right," he said quietly, straightening to his full height despite the pain in his injured leg. "You want to see what a real soldier looks like? I'll show you." The change in his demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. The slight limp disappeared as military posture took over. His voice dropped to the calm, controlled tone that had once directed life and death operations in hostile territory. His eyes, which had been downcast and tired just moments before, now held the steady gaze of a predator evaluating its prey. For the first time since following him outside, the 3 men began to sense that they might have made a serious miscalculation. But they had gone too far to back down now without losing face in front of each other, and their alcohol-impaired judgment prevented them from recognizing the extent of their mistake. The leader reached out to grab Jake's shirt, intending to shove him against the truck. It was the last voluntary movement he would make for the next several minutes. What happened next took less than 30 seconds, but, for Jake Mitchell, it felt like time moved in slow motion. Every detail became crystal clear as years of elite military training override his civilian restraint. The moment the leader's hand touched his shirt, muscle memory took control. Jake's left hand shot up to trap the man's wrist against his chest while his right elbow drove backward into the attacker's solar plexus. The strike was precise and devastating, delivered with the kind of controlled violence that could only come from thousands of hours of practice. The leader folded forward, gasping for air that wouldn't come, his eyes wide with shock and sudden understanding. Before the other 2 men could react, Jake spun to face them, his injured leg forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. The second attacker threw a wild punch that Jake caught effortlessly, using the man's momentum to drive his knee into the attacker's ribs. The sound of cracking bone echoed across the parking lot as the man crumpled to the asphalt. The third man turned to run, but Jake's hand closed on his shoulder like a steel trap. A simple hip toss sent the would-be robber tumbling across the pavement, his designer clothes tearing on the rough surface. In less than half a minute, 3 men who had been confident in their ability to intimidate and rob a disabled veteran lay groaning on the ground. Jake stood over them, breathing normally, his expression calm and controlled. The transformation from victim to predator had been so complete and sudden that the attackers were still struggling to understand what had happened to them. "Now," Jake said in the same quiet voice he had used throughout the confrontation, "I want you to listen very carefully." The leader tried to sit up, still struggling to catch his breath from the elbow strike. Jake's boot pressed gently but firmly against his chest, keeping him flat on his back. "You made several mistakes today," Jake continued, his tone conversational but carrying an unmistakable authority. "The first mistake was assuming that someone's appearance tells you anything about their capabilities. The second mistake was following me outside when I tried to leave peacefully. The third mistake was putting your hands on me. The man on the ground with the broken ribs was whimpering softly, cradling his injured side. The third attacker had managed to sit up but made no move to rise further, apparently recognizing that any aggressive action would be met with swift and painful consequences. "I want you to understand something," Jake said, crouching down so he could look the leader directly in the eyes. "I am exactly what you mocked in there. I am a United States Navy SEAL, disabled in service to my country. The men I served with were better men than you will ever be, and they died protecting people like you, even though you don't deserve it." The leader's bravado had evaporated completely. Up close, he could see the network of scars on Jake's arms, the slight discoloration around his eyes that spoke of facial trauma, and, most importantly, the absolute certainty in his gaze. This was not a man who made idle threats or exaggerated his capabilities. "I could have killed all three of you before you hit the ground," Jake continued matter-of-factly. "I chose not to because taking a life is not something I do lightly, even when dealing with people as worthless as you. But I want you to understand that this restraint is a choice, not a limitation." A small crowd had begun to gather at the bar's windows, drawn by the commotion outside. Tom Murphy stood in the doorway, his cell phone in hand, ready to call police if necessary. But he made no move to intervene, recognizing that Jake had the situation completely under control. Jake stood up slowly, his injured leg reminding him of its limitations as the adrenaline began to fade. But he showed no sign of pain or weakness as he looked down at the three men. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to get up, get in your car, and drive away. You're going to avoid this establishment in the future. And you're going to remember this lesson the next time you think about disrespecting someone who served their country." The leader struggled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and pain. His expensive shirt was torn and dirty, and his carefully styled hair hung in disarray. The image he had worked so hard to project lay in ruins around him. "This isn't over," he muttered, trying to salvage some dignity from the humiliating defeat. Jake's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes that made the man take an involuntary step backward. "Yes, it is," Jake said simply. "Because if I see any of you again, if you come back here looking for revenge, if you bother any of the people in this bar, I will finish what you started today. And, I promise you, you will not enjoy the experience." The threat was delivered without emotion or theatrical posturing, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying than any amount of shouting or cursing would have been. The three men looked at each other uncertainly, apparently trying to decide whether their injured pride was worth the risk of further humiliation. The decision was made for them when Tom Murphy stepped outside, his weathered face set in hard lines. "You boys need to move along now," the bar owner said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had seen real combat. "And, if I were you, I'd think real hard about whether I wanted to press charges against a disabled veteran who was just defending himself." The reminder of potential legal consequences seemed to penetrate their alcohol-fogged thinking. The three men limped toward a black SUV parked near the front of the lot, their earlier swagger replaced by shame and defeat. The man with broken ribs had to be helped by his companions, and all three moved with the careful posture of people who had learned painful lessons about their own limitations. Jake watched them go, his body gradually relaxing as the immediate threat passed. But he remained alert until their vehicle disappeared down the street, old habits ensuring that he confirmed the danger was truly gone. "You okay?" Tom asked, studying Jake with the concerned eyes of a fellow veteran. "I'm fine," Jake replied, though his voice carried a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Sorry about the trouble." "Don't apologize," Tom said firmly. "Those idiots brought it on themselves. You showed remarkable restraint, actually. I've seen bar fights that started over a lot less and ended much worse." The crowd at the windows had begun to disperse, but Jake could see the curiosity in their faces. By tomorrow, the story would be all over town, probably growing with each telling. He had worked so hard to maintain a low profile since moving here, and now that anonymity was gone forever. "Why don't you come back inside?" Tom suggested. "First drinks on the house." "Hell, first 3 drinks are on the house. You've earned them." Jake shook his head politely. "Thanks, but I think I've had enough excitement for one day. Maybe I'll see you tomorrow." Jake, Tom called as he reached for his truck door. "For what it's worth, your teammates would be proud of how you handled that. You could have hurt those boys a lot worse than you did, but you chose mercy instead. That takes more strength than violence." The words hit Jake harder than any of the physical blows he had deflected. He had spent 3 years wondering if he was still the man his fallen teammates had believed him to be, whether the trauma and guilt had fundamentally changed who he was at his core. "Thanks, Tom," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." The drive home gave Jake time to process what had happened and what it might mean for his carefully constructed new life. He lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, chosen specifically because it was quiet and allowed him to maintain his privacy. The building was older but well-maintained, with a landlord who respected his tenants' need for peace and quiet. His apartment reflected his military background and current circumstances. The furniture was simple and functional, chosen for durability rather than style. Everything had its place, and everything was kept in perfect order. The only decorations were a few framed photographs of his SEAL team and a flag that had flown over their base in Afghanistan. Jake made himself a cup of coffee and sat in his favorite chair, looking out the window at the mountains in the distance. The familiar ritual helped calm his mind and allowed him to think through the implications of the afternoon's events. The physical confrontation had been necessary and justified. He had tried to walk away, had attempted to de-escalate the situation, and had only resorted to violence when directly threatened. Any reasonable person would understand that he had acted in self-defense against superior numbers. But Jake also knew that the community's perception of him had changed forever. No longer would he be just another veteran trying to live quietly and heal from his wounds. Now he would be known as the man who had single-handedly defeated 3 attackers in a parking lot. Some people would see him as a hero, others as someone to be feared or avoided. The attention was the last thing he wanted. Jake had moved to this town specifically because it was small enough that he could blend in but large enough that he wouldn't stand out as the only newcomer. He had built relationships slowly and carefully, always conscious of the need to appear stable and non-threatening to civilians who might be uncomfortable around combat veterans. His therapist had warned him about this possibility during their sessions. Dr. Chen had explained that sometimes traumatic experiences created a cycle where veterans felt compelled to prove their worth through violence, even when peaceful solutions were available. She had worked with him extensively on recognizing those triggers and developing alternative responses. But this situation had been different. Jake had genuinely tried to avoid conflict and had only fought back when directly threatened. He had used exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize the threat and no more. Most importantly, he had maintained complete control throughout the encounter, never allowing anger or ego to drive his actions. The real test would be how he handled the aftermath. In the past, Jake might have dwelled on the confrontation, replaying it endlessly and looking for ways he could have handled it differently. He might have felt guilty about hurting people, even people who had threatened him first. Or he might have felt a surge of pride at proving his skills still intact, leading him to seek out similar confrontations. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of balance. He had faced a threatening situation and responded appropriately. He had protected himself without becoming the aggressor. He had honored his training and his teammates' memory without compromising his principles or his progress toward healing. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Dr. Chen's office number, which was unusual since their next appointment wasn't scheduled until the following week. "Hello, Dr. Chen," he answered. "Jake, I just heard about what happened at Murphy's bar," she said without preamble. "Tom Murphy called me. He was concerned about how you might be processing the experience." Jake smiled slightly. It was typical of the bar owner to think about the psychological implications of what had happened rather than just the physical aspects. Vietnam veterans understood that the real battles often continued long after the immediate danger had passed. "I'm doing okay," Jake said honestly. "Better than I expected, actually. Do you want to talk about it?" Jake considered the offer. For 3 years, his sessions with Dr. Chen had been a lifeline, helping him navigate the complex emotions and memories that came with surviving when others hadn't. She had never judged him for his struggles or made him feel weak for needing help. "I think I handled it the right way," he said finally. "I tried to leave, I warned them multiple times, and I only fought when they forced the issue. Most importantly, I stayed in control the whole time." Tom said the same thing. He was impressed by your restraint. "The old me might have taken it further," Jake admitted. "Might have hurt them worse than necessary, just because I was angry about what they said about veterans. But I kept thinking about our sessions, about the difference between necessary force and gratuitous violence." Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, and Jake could almost hear her processing his words. "How do you feel about it now?" she asked. "Tired," Jake said truthfully. "And concerned about how this might change things in town. I was starting to feel like I belonged here, like I was just another resident instead of the damaged veteran who needed special treatment." "Jake, you defended yourself against 3 attackers who tried to rob you. Anyone in that situation would have done the same thing. The fact that you handled it efficiently doesn't make you a threat to the community." "I know that logically," Jake replied. "But I also know how civilians react to displays of military training. They either want to hero worship you or they're afraid of what you might do if you lose control. And which reaction concerns you more?" Jake considered the question carefully. "Both, actually. I don't want to be seen as some kind of action hero, and I don't want people to be afraid of me either. I just want to be treated like a normal person." "Then, that's how you'll present yourself," Dr. Chen said practically. "You go about your business the same way you always have. You treat people the same way you always have. If they want to make this incident into something bigger than it was, that's their choice. But you don't have to participate in that narrative." The advice was simple and sensible, but Jake knew that implementation would be more challenging. Small towns had long memories, and extraordinary events took on lives of their own through repetition and embellishment. "There's something else," Jake said after a moment. "When I was fighting them, for those few seconds, I felt like myself again. Not the broken veteran, not the guy with the limp and the nightmares. I felt like the person I used to be before everything went wrong." "And how does that make you feel now?" "Conflicted," Jake admitted. "Part of me is relieved to know that person is still in there somewhere. But another part of me is concerned about what that means for my progress toward building a peaceful life." Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Jake, you've spent 3 years learning to manage your trauma and build coping mechanisms for civilian life. That's important work, and it's made you a healthier person. But healing doesn't mean erasing who you were or what you're capable of. It means integrating all parts of yourself into a balanced whole." "I'm not sure I understand." "You were a Navy SEAL for 8 years. That's not something you can just turn off, nor should you want to. The skills and mindset that made you effective in that role are part of who you are. The goal isn't to suppress that part of yourself, but to learn when and how to access it appropriately." Jake felt something shift in his understanding of his own journey. For 3 years, he had been fighting against his military identity, seeing it as something that interfered with his ability to be a peaceful civilian. But maybe the real challenge was learning to be both. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now you go back to your life," Dr. Chen said simply. "You go to Murphy's Bar if you want to. You interact with your neighbors the same way you always have. You continue working on yourself and building the life you want. And if anyone has a problem with how you defended yourself today, that's their issue to work through, not yours." After hanging up, Jake sat in his chair for a long time, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The events of the day had changed something fundamental in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. He was still a disabled veteran dealing with trauma and working toward healing. But he was also still a Navy SEAL, with all the capabilities and responsibilities that identity carried. The challenge now was learning to be both without letting either identity overwhelm the other. It was a different kind of mission than any he had undertaken before, but perhaps no less important than the ones he had completed in uniform. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. People would react to what had happened today in various ways, and Jake would need to navigate those reactions while staying true to himself and his principles. But, for the first time in 3 years, he felt ready for whatever came next. The man who had defeated 3 attackers in a parking lot was the same man who struggled with nightmares and survivor's guilt. The veteran who could incapacitate multiple opponents without breaking a sweat was also the person who worked patiently with his therapist to build healthy coping mechanisms. Jake Mitchell was beginning to understand that he didn't have to choose between these different aspects of himself. The real strength lay in learning to be whole. The next morning brought an unexpected development that changed everything Jake Mitchell thought he knew about the previous day's confrontation. He was drinking coffee and reading the news on his tablet when his phone rang with an unknown local number. "Is this Jake Mitchell?" The voice belonged to a young woman who sounded nervous and uncertain. "Yes, who's calling?" "My name is Rebecca Santos. I'm a reporter for the local newspaper. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about what happened at Murphy's bar yesterday." Jake closed his eyes and took a slow breath. He had hoped the incident would remain a minor local story, something that would be forgotten within a few days. But, apparently the news had spread faster and farther than he had anticipated. "I'd prefer not to comment," he said politely. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand your reluctance, but there's something you should know. The 3 men you encountered yesterday have filed a police report claiming that you assaulted them without provocation. They're saying you attacked them in the parking lot because they were making noise in the bar." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He had expected potential complications from the confrontation, but this level of dishonesty caught him completely off guard. "That's not what happened," he said carefully. "I believe you," Rebecca replied quickly. "I've already spoken to several witnesses who were in the bar, and their version of events is very different from what these men are claiming. But the police have to investigate the complaint, and I thought you deserved to know what you're facing." Jake felt his carefully constructed peace beginning to crumble. He had worked so hard to build a quiet life, to stay out of trouble, to prove that he could be a stable member of the community. Now he was facing potential criminal charges based on the lies of 3 men who had tried to rob him. "What exactly are they claiming?" he asked. Rebecca hesitated before answering. "They're saying that you became aggressive when they asked you to keep quiet in the bar, that you followed them outside, and that you attacked them when they tried to leave peacefully. They claim you used some kind of martial arts training to seriously injure them. The irony would have been funny if the situation weren't so serious. The men who had followed him outside, blocked his path to his truck, and attempted to rob him were now portraying themselves as innocent victims of an unprovoked assault. They also filed complaints claiming you threatened to kill them if they ever came back to the bar," Rebecca continued. "They're asking for restraining orders and pressing for assault charges." Jake realized that he was dealing with something more sophisticated than simple bullies looking for easy prey. These men understood how to manipulate the legal system to their advantage, how to present themselves as victims rather than aggressors. "Mr. Mitchell, I've been covering crime in this county for 5 years, and this story doesn't make sense," Rebecca said. 3 healthy young men don't get beaten up by 1 disabled veteran unless something else was going on. The witnesses I've talked to paint a very different picture of what happened." "What are the witnesses saying?" "They confirm that the 3 men were harassing you inside the bar, making disparaging comments about veterans and disabled people. They saw the men follow you outside, and several people watched the confrontation through the windows. Everyone I've spoken to agrees that you were defending yourself." Jake felt some of his tension ease. At least the truth wasn't completely buried under the false narrative his attackers were spinning. "But here's the problem," Rebecca continued. "The men you fought have connections in this community. The leader, Marcus Webb, is the son of City Councilman Richard Webb. His family owns several businesses in town, and they have influence with local law enforcement." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Jake had wondered why 3 apparent strangers had been so confident about harassing and threatening him. Now he understood that they were used to getting away with their behavior because of family connections and local influence. "I'm not trying to scare you," Rebecca said, "but you need to understand what you're up against. This isn't just about a bar fight anymore. This is about power and influence and people who aren't used to being held accountable for their actions. Jake thanked Rebecca for the warning and ended the call, his mind racing through the implications of what he had learned. In Afghanistan, the enemy had been clearly identified and the rules of engagement were well defined. Here, he was facing a different kind of warfare, one fought with lawyers and influence rather than weapons and tactics. An hour later, Jake's doorbell rang. Through the peephole, he could see 2 police officers standing on his front step. He took a moment to compose himself before opening the door. Jake Mitchell? The older officer was a sergeant with gray hair and tired eyes who looked like he had seen too much during his career. Yes, sir. I'm Sergeant Williams, this is Officer Chen. We need to ask you some questions about an incident yesterday at Murphy's bar. Jake invited them in and offered coffee, which they declined. The 2 officers sat on his couch while Jake took his usual chair, maintaining the respectful distance that felt appropriate for the formal nature of their visit. We've received a complaint from 3 men claiming that you assaulted them without provocation, Sergeant Williams began. They're alleging that you used excessive force and made threats against their lives. That's not what happened, Jake said calmly. I was having lunch at Murphy's when they began harassing me. I tried to leave peacefully, but they followed me outside and attempted to rob me. I defended myself using the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. Officer Chen took notes while Sergeant Williams asked follow-up questions about the timeline of events, the specific words that were exchanged, and the nature of the physical confrontation. Jake answered each question honestly and completely, providing as much detail as he could remember. The complainants claim you threatened to kill them if they returned to the bar, Sergeant Williams said. Do you recall making any threats? Jake thought carefully before answering. I told them that if they came back looking for revenge or if they bothered the people in the bar, I would finish what they started. I did not threaten to kill anyone. But, you did threaten them with physical violence? I warned them about the consequences of continuing their aggressive behavior, Jake corrected. After they had already attempted to rob me and I had defended myself successfully. Sergeant Williams made notes in his report while Officer Chen continued studying Jake with curious eyes. Finally, the younger officer spoke for the first time. Mr. Mitchell, are you by any chance related to Lieutenant Chris Chun who served in Afghanistan? The question caught Jake completely off guard. Chris Chen was one of my teammates. He died in an IED explosion 3 years ago. How did you know him? He was my older brother, Officer Chen replied quietly. He wrote to our family about his team leader, a guy named Jake who kept everyone together under impossible circumstances. He said you saved his life more than once before. The young officer's voice trailed off, but Jake understood. Chris had written home about their missions, about the bonds between teammates, about the man who had survived when Chris hadn't. Your brother was a good man and an outstanding officer, Jake said softly. He died protecting a convoy of Afghan children. His sacrifice saved innocent lives. Officer Chen nodded, struggling with emotions that he was trying to keep professional. Sergeant Williams looked between his partner and Jake with growing understanding. Mr. Mitchell, the sergeant said carefully, we've also interviewed several witnesses from the bar yesterday. Their accounts of what happened don't match the complainant's version of events at all. What are the witnesses saying? That 3 men harassed you for an extended period, followed you outside when you tried to leave, and initiated the physical confrontation. Multiple people saw them block your path to your vehicle and saw what appeared to be an attempted robbery. Jake felt a surge of relief that the truth was coming to light, but he also recognized that the situation was far from resolved. However, Sergeant Williams continued, we still have to investigate the complaint thoroughly. The complainants are claiming significant injuries, and they have family influence in the community that complicates matters. Officer Chan leaned forward slightly. Mr. Mitchell, the 3 men you fought are known to local law enforcement. Marcus Webb and his friends have been involved in several incidents over the past few years, but charges have always been dropped or reduced due to family pressure. What kind of incidents? Bar fights, harassment complaints, suspected drug dealing. Nothing ever sticks because witnesses suddenly become reluctant to testify, or complainants decide not to pursue charges. Jake began to understand that he had stumbled into a larger pattern of behavior and corruption. His confrontation with the three men wasn't an isolated incident but part of an ongoing problem that local authorities had been unable or unwilling to address effectively. The difference this time, Sergeant Williams said, is that they picked the wrong target. You're not some civilian who can be intimidated into backing down. And your military record gives you credibility that's hard to undermine. But they're still pressing charges? They are, but I don't think they'll stick. Too many witnesses, too many inconsistencies in their story, and, frankly, too much evidence that they initiated the confrontation. Officer Chen added, there's also the matter of their injuries. All three men were treated at the emergency room, but their wounds are consistent with defensive actions, not an unprovoked assault. The emergency room doctor noted that the injuries suggested someone with professional training defending against multiple attackers. Jake nodded, understanding the technical details that would matter in any legal proceedings. His SEAL training had emphasized precise, controlled violence that achieved specific tactical objectives without unnecessary damage. What happens next? Jake asked. We complete our investigation, file our report, and make a recommendation to the prosecutor, Sergeant Williams explained. Based on what we've learned so far, I doubt you'll face any charges. If anything, we might be looking at filing charges against the three complainants for attempted robbery and filing a false police report. After the officers left, Jake called Dr. Chen to update her on the developing situation. She listened without interruption as he explained about the false police report, the family connections, and the revelation about Officer Chen's relationship to his fallen teammate. How are you processing all of this? She asked when he finished. I'm angry, Jake admitted. Not about having to defend myself, but about their attempt to twist the truth and make themselves into victims. It feels like they're disrespecting everyone who has ever served by playing these games with the legal system. That's a reasonable emotional response, Dr. Chen replied. But I'm more interested in how you're planning to handle that anger moving forward. Jake considered her question carefully. 3 years ago, he would have been consumed by rage at the injustice and the disrespect. He might have done something reckless to retaliate against the men who were trying to destroy his reputation and his peace. I'm going to let the legal system work, he said finally. I'm going to cooperate fully with the investigation and trust that the truth will come out. And I'm going to continue building the life I want instead of letting these people derail my progress. That's exactly the right approach, Dr. Chen said approvingly. You've learned to separate your emotional reactions from your behavioral choices. That's the real victory here, regardless of what happens with the legal issues. That evening, Jake returned to Murphy's bar for the first time since the confrontation. He had debated whether to stay away until the legal situation was resolved, but ultimately decided that hiding would only validate his attacker's narrative that he was the aggressor who didn't belong in the community. The bar was busier than usual for a weeknight, and Jake noticed several curious glances as he made his way to his regular table. But Tom Murphy greeted him with a warm smile and a firm handshake that spoke volumes about where the bar owner's sympathies lay. Heard you had a visit from the police today, Tom said as he brought Jake his usual coffee. Word travels fast in a small town. Officer Chen stopped by after his shift. Nice young man. He said his brother served with you. Jake nodded, still processing the emotional impact of that unexpected connection. Chris was a good man. He deserved better than what happened to him. From what I hear, he couldn't have asked for a better team leader, Tom replied. His brother has a lot of respect for what you did over there. As the evening progressed, several other customers approached Jake's table to express their support. An elderly veteran of the Korean War bought him a beer and shared his own story of dealing with young troublemakers who thought military service was something to mock. A local business owner mentioned that he had been harassed by Marcus Webb and his friends on several occasions but had never felt safe enough to file complaints. Most significantly, a middle-aged woman introduced herself as the mother of one of the witnesses from the previous day's incident. My son Danny was in the bar when those men were harassing you, she said. He told me what really happened, and I wanted you to know that there are people in this community who recognize the difference between right and wrong." "I appreciate that," Jake replied sincerely. "Those web boys think they can do whatever they want because of their family name," she continued. "It's about time someone stood up to them. My son said you showed remarkable restraint given what they put you through." As the woman returned to her table, Jake realized that the confrontation had exposed deeper community tensions that had been building for years. His decision to defend himself had become a symbol of resistance against a pattern of entitled behavior that many residents had witnessed but felt powerless to address. Tom Murphy confirmed this assessment when he stopped by Jake's table later in the evening. "You've got more support in this community than you might realize," the bar owner said. "People are tired of the Webb family using their influence to let their son and his friends get away with behavior that would get anyone else arrested." "I never meant for this to become a big community issue," Jake replied. "I just wanted to be left alone." "Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for other people too, whether you intended it or not," Tom observed. "The way I see it, you did what a good man does when confronted with bullies. You tried to walk away, and, when that wasn't possible, you handled the situation with appropriate force." Jake understood that his actions had resonated beyond the immediate circumstances of the confrontation. In defending himself against 3 entitled bullies, he had inadvertently challenged a system of local privilege and corruption that had been operating unchecked for years. The legal battle that lay ahead would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the community's willingness to hold powerful families accountable for their children's behavior. It was a responsibility he had never sought, but one that his military training and personal principles wouldn't allow him to shirk. As Jake prepared to leave Murphy's bar that night, he reflected on how much his life had changed in just 48 hours. The quiet anonymity he had worked so hard to maintain was gone forever, replaced by a public role as a symbol of resistance against corruption and entitlement. But, for the first time since his injury, Jake felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The mission had changed, but his commitment to protecting the innocent and standing up for what was right remained as strong as ever. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, as the legal system determined whether truth and justice could prevail over influence and corruption. Jake Mitchell had faced longer odds in Afghanistan, and he was ready for whatever came next. 3 weeks after the confrontation at Murphy's bar, Jake Mitchell sat in the courthouse waiting room, dressed in his best civilian clothes and accompanied by a lawyer he couldn't really afford. The legal proceedings had moved faster than anyone expected, driven partly by media attention and partly by community pressure for a resolution. Rebecca Santos, the newspaper reporter who had first warned him about the false charges, had turned the story into a series of investigative articles that exposed years of misconduct by Marcus Webb and his associates. The articles detailed incidents of harassment, assault, suspected drug dealing, and witness intimidation that painted a clear picture of young men who believed their family connections made them untouchable. The series had attracted attention from regional news outlets and even a few national publications interested in the story of a disabled Navy SEAL fighting corruption in a small Oregon town. Jake hated the publicity, but his lawyer explained that public scrutiny might be their best protection against a rigged legal process. "Mr. Mitchell?" A young woman in a business suit approached him. "I'm Sarah Kim, the prosecutor assigned to your case. Could we speak privately for a moment?" Jake followed her to a small conference room where she spread several files across the table. Her expression was serious but not unfriendly as she began explaining the current status of the case. "I'll be direct with you," she said. "The charges against you are being dropped. There's overwhelming evidence that you acted in self-defense against multiple attackers who initiated the confrontation and attempted to rob you." Jake felt a surge of relief that he tried to keep from showing on his face. "What about the complainants' injuries and their claims that I threatened them?" "Their injuries are completely consistent with defensive actions taken against multiple assailants. The emergency room reports support your version of events, not theirs. As for the alleged threats, we have multiple witnesses who confirm that you warned them against future aggressive behavior, which is perfectly legal under the circumstances." Sarah Kim pulled out another file and opened it on the table. "However, we are filing charges against Marcus Webb, David Palmer, and Robert Torres for attempted robbery, assault, filing false police reports, and intimidation of witnesses. Intimidation of witnesses? After our investigation became public, several people came forward with additional complaints about these three men. But we also discovered that they had been contacting some of the witnesses from the bar incident, trying to pressure them to change their statements. Jake shook his head in amazement at the continued poor judgment displayed by his former attackers. Even when facing potential criminal charges, they couldn't resist trying to manipulate the system in their favor. There's something else, the prosecutor continued. We've been investigating their activities for several months now, based on complaints that were never properly pursued due to political considerations. Your case gave us the opening we needed to take action. Jake realized that his decision to stand up for himself had provided law enforcement with the credibility and public support necessary to challenge a pattern of corruption that had been protected for years. The Webb family has hired expensive lawyers from Portland, and they're fighting the charges aggressively, Sarah Kim explained. But the evidence is strong, and we have community support that makes it politically impossible to sweep this under the rug like previous incidents. An hour later, Jake emerged from the courthouse into brilliant sunshine and a crowd of reporters and supporters. Tom Murphy stood near the front steps with a group of regular customers from his bar, all wearing veteran support pins and holding small American flags. "How does it feel to be vindicated?" one reporter called out. Jake considered the question carefully before answering. "I'm relieved that the truth came out and that the legal system worked the way it's supposed to. But I want to be clear that this was never about me personally. This was about holding people accountable for their actions, regardless of their family connections or social status." "What's next for you?" another reporter asked. "I'm going back to my life," Jake replied simply. "I'm going to continue working on my recovery and being a productive member of this community. That's all I ever wanted." But Jake knew that his life had been permanently changed by the events of the past few weeks. The quiet anonymity he had sought was gone forever, replaced by a public profile as someone who had successfully challenged local corruption. The role came with responsibilities he had never sought but couldn't ignore. Over the following months, Jake found himself becoming an unofficial advocate for other veterans and community members who had been victimized by people who believed their connections made them untouchable. He didn't seek out these situations, but people began approaching him with their problems, apparently believing that his success against the Webb family meant he could help them too. Dr. Chen helped him navigate this new reality during their regular sessions. "You've become a symbol," she explained during one appointment. "Sometimes that happens to people who take a stand when others can't or won't. The question is how you're going to handle that responsibility." "I never wanted to be anyone's symbol," Jake replied. "I just wanted to be left alone to heal and build a quiet life." "And that's exactly why people respect you," Dr. Chen pointed out. "You didn't seek out conflict or publicity. You just stood up for yourself when it was necessary, and you handled the situation with integrity and restraint." The conversation helped Jake understand that his new role in the community didn't have to interfere with his personal healing journey. In fact, helping other people deal with their problems had given him a sense of purpose that complemented his recovery rather than undermining it. 6 months after the courthouse proceedings, Marcus Webb and his 2 associates were convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to significant jail time and community service. More importantly for the community, their convictions sent a clear message that family influence couldn't protect people from the consequences of their criminal behavior. The Webb family's political power began to crumble as other victims gained the courage to come forward with their own stories. City Councilman Richard Webb was defeated in the next election, and several businesses associated with the family faced boycotts and legal challenges. Jake watched these developments with satisfaction but without the desire for revenge that might have consumed him in the past. Justice had been served through proper legal channels, and the community was healing from years of corruption and intimidation. His own healing had progressed beyond what he thought possible when he first moved to the small Oregon town. The nightmares came less frequently, his relationship with his injured leg had improved through physical therapy, and, most importantly, he had learned to integrate all aspects of his identity into a balanced whole. The disabled veteran who struggled with trauma was also the Navy SEAL who could handle dangerous situations with professional competence. The man who worked patiently with his therapist was the same person who had stood up to bullies and corruption when the community needed someone to take that stand. A year after the confrontation at Murphy's Bar, Jake was approached by the local high school principal about speaking to students about military service and civic responsibility. The idea terrified him initially, but Dr. Chin encouraged him to view it as another step in his recovery process. Public speaking about your experiences can be therapeutic, she explained. It helps you process your own story while potentially helping other people understand important issues. Jake's first speaking engagement was awkward and nerve-wracking, but he discovered that sharing his story in a controlled environment felt different from having it exploited by media outlets. He talked about the importance of service, the reality of military life, and the challenges faced by veterans returning to civilian society. But he also talked about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. He explained that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the willingness to do the right thing despite that fear. The student response was overwhelmingly positive, and word spread to other schools and community organizations. Soon Jake was receiving regular requests to speak at various events, though he was careful to limit his commitments to preserve his own emotional well-being. Tom Murphy noticed the change in Jake during one of his regular visits to the bar. "You look like a man who's found his purpose," the bar owner observed. "I think I have," Jake replied. "It's not what I expected when I moved here, but it feels right." "Your teammates would be proud," Tom said simply. The comment hit Jake with unexpected emotional force. For 3 years, he had struggled with survivor's guilt and wondered whether he was honoring the memory of his fallen brothers. Now he understood that the best way to honor them was to continue serving in whatever capacity his circumstances allowed. The mission had changed from military operations in hostile territory to community advocacy in small-town America. But the fundamental principles remained the same: protect the innocent, stand up to bullies, and never compromise on integrity even when it would be easier to look the other way. Jake's story had begun with 3 drunk bullies spitting on his shoes and mocking his service to their country. They had intended to humiliate him, to make him feel powerless and insignificant. Instead, their actions had set in motion a series of events that transformed both Jake's life and his entire community. The vengeance they experienced wasn't the violent retribution they might have expected from someone with Jake's training and background. Instead, it was the methodical application of justice through proper legal channels, supported by a community that had finally found the courage to stand up to corruption and entitlement. Marcus Webb and his associates learned that actions have consequences, regardless of family connections or social status. The Webb family discovered that political influence couldn't protect them from the results of their son's criminal behavior. And the community learned that ordinary people could challenge powerful interests when they stood together for truth and justice. But perhaps the most important transformation was Jake's own journey from isolated veteran struggling with trauma to engaged community leader helping others find their own courage. He had learned to integrate all aspects of his identity, the warrior, the victim, the healer, the advocate, into a unified whole that honored both his past service and his present responsibilities. The confrontation that began with intended humiliation had become a story of redemption, justice, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they refused to accept corruption as inevitable. Jake Mitchell had found his new mission, and he was ready to serve his community with the same dedication and integrity that had once served his country. The uniform was different, and the battlefield had changed, but the commitment to protecting others and standing up for what's right remained as strong as ever. In the end, the 3 men who thought spitting would humiliate a disabled veteran had accomplished something they never intended. They had reminded Jake Mitchell that he was still a Navy SEAL, with all the responsibilities and capabilities that identity carried. Their attempt at humiliation had become the catalyst for his complete recovery and his community's renewal. It was a vengeance more complete and satisfying than any violence could have achieved, delivered through the very system of justice and democracy that Jake had sworn to defend. The bullies had gotten exactly what they deserved, and everyone else had gotten something far more valuable: proof that courage and integrity could still triumph over corruption and entitlement. Jake's new life had begun with the sound of spitting and laughter in a bar parking lot. It had evolved into something far more meaningful, a second chance at service and a reminder that heroes weren't defined by their wounds but by their willingness to keep fighting for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The mission continued, and Jake Mitchell was exactly where he belonged.